Elizabeth Kolbert has worked as a journalist for 2 decades, writing extensively on the environment and climate change. She has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1999. Kolbert is the editor of the best American science and nature writing and the author of The Prophet of Love, Field Notes from a Catastrophe and the Sixth Extinction, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize for Nonfiction in 2015. Kolbert's latest book, Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future, was published in February last year. Betsy, thank you so much for being with us this evening at the library. Virtually.
Thanks.
Albeit virtually.
Thanks for having me. Yes, I'm sad not to be in Paris.
Well, as we say to now so many people, as soon as you can get to Paris, we will absolutely host you in person, and very much looking forward to it. I suppose my first kind of question or way into your really, really fantastic book that I've now read about 3 times as I prepared for our conversation is just to kind of lay some groundwork. And it seems to me that the thesis of Under a White Sky, Betsy, is twofold. And the first part that I would like to talk about is this idea or this kind of reality that we find ourselves firmly in the Anthropocene. And for anyone who doesn't know what that is or has heard the word but isn't quite sure, it's the period in which human activity has been the dominant influence on the natural world. So in the book, again and again, you cite scientists who describe themselves as realists. In the case of one biologist, she could describe herself as a futurist. And all of this kind of accumulation is meant to make us understand that we've reached the point of no return, as it were. And yet it seems to me that on some level, we can't really accept this reality. It's kind of irrational, emotional. I include myself in this category, that there's some part of us that wants to hold on to an obsolete, you might argue, notion of nature, as well as an obsolete kind of notion of the return to nature. Another way of putting this is, even if we aren't necessarily attached to a romantic kind of bucolic version of nature, where we are likely opposed or even repulsed by this idea of the artificial manipulation of what we like to believe is natural, say, for example, in genetically modified organisms. So I guess my first question to kind of set the scene here is, can you talk a little bit about where does this kind of created category of nature come from? And why are we so attached to it, even though, as you're probably going to say, it is entirely artificial?
Well, that's that's a really good question, Alice. I mean, I think, I mean, I guess if I were to go way back, you know, there was this Goethe quote actually that I wanted to get into the book, but I failed to. It's actually, if you've been to the Bryant Park subway station and you're sort of wandering around underneath the subways, underneath the New York Public Library, actually, that subway station, you might come across this quote, and it says, I think I'll get it mostly right. It's the natural, even that is natural. And the divide, you know, that was obviously said at a you know, moment of, or written at a moment of high German romanticism. And I do think, you know, you alluded to the romantic view of nature, which I do think that we are still all, for one reason or another, not because we necessarily read the German romantics, but has affected us all, and we still live with that. And in the US, you know, to speak in a US-centric way, the idea of wilderness, you know, in wilderness lies the salvation, you know, the famous Thoreau line, which I mangled just now. But I think we were very attached to this idea that there's something beyond ourselves that we can't touch and we don't control. You could argue that's, you know, a form of self-hatred or something that, and there's also, I do want to say, I think there's a very strong, you know, religious tradition here too, obviously. And I'm not qualified to speak, you know, to the whole Judeo-Christian tradition, but clearly nature has been something that, you know, was created not, you know, by humans and not even for humans, but had some kind of independent existence. And that has nurtured us, I guess you could say, on some level for quite a long time. And to get to a point where we have to acknowledge or accept that that is gone does seem to be leave a very, very big gaping hole. And once again, is it self-mistrust? It's certainly when we look around the world right now and look at the impacts of the Anthropocene, as they say in America, the Anthropocene, as they say in England, we don't like it very much. So, could there be a manufactured nature that we like? In some ways, there is everywhere. Go to the national parks in the US. Those are all very heavily managed. Even wilderness areas in the US are very heavily managed. So, the line between the human and the natural has been blurred for centuries, you could argue, for millennia, you could argue. And we're not automatically revolted by it when we see it. But when we think about it, we feel somehow we feel a lot of consternation, I think. And it's a question that I've taken a long time sort of not to answer. I don't know exactly what the answer is.
Do you feel that this kind of attachment to this past, or now maybe obsolete, understanding of nature is actually preventing us from acting more quickly and pragmatically at this late stage in the day?
Well, I think that's another good question. I think that, another point I guess I would make is that most of the sort of long arc of science, of Western science, has been to really displace humans from their centrality, right? So, first we get that the sun doesn't revolve around the earth revolves around the sun. Then we get Darwin and the descent of man. We're just another animal. We're not really that special. And that was really the dominant, through line of a lot of the discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries. And now in the 21st century, to have to sort of step back and say, well, we really are dominant and we really have gotten ourselves, in a jam up. We've taken a long time, and we still haven't, obviously, clearly responded to that in what you would argue would be a rational way. I mean, even if we were just rational creatures, we would be doing things very differently. And how much of that relates to, sort of deep, sociobiological forces, and how much of that is just we're in a terrible jam. There are a lot of people on the planet. It's very difficult to support a lot of people on the planet without manipulating the natural world. It's simply not possible, you could argue, at this point. And then there are obviously huge economic forces at work that are very, very attached to the status quo. So there are so many forces that are conspiring, you could argue, to prevent us from doing what, on some level, we, and I use the term we very loosely, know we ought to be doing, responding in the way we should be responding.
Yeah, and we're going to get onto kind of the various responses that you lay out in the book, because they kind of start smaller, and then by the end they're these enormous, all-encapsulating scientific revolutions, if you like. But before we do that, I want to kind of lay out the main piece of your argument, which is that if the Anthropocene is this idea of man controlling nature, which, as you pointed out, is not at all a new one. In fact, you cited, I really like this quote, Thoreau in the 1950s, and he was lamenting the disappearance of the moose, the cougar, beavers in New England, and he wrote, "Is it not a maimed and imperfect nature I am conversant with?" So this was already happening, nearly 200 years ago. So if the Anthropocene is this idea of man controlling nature, which has left us with many calamities, just to name a few, we're all kind of aware of this at this point: ozone depletion, ocean warming, ocean acidification, sea level rises, etc. Then you write, according to the logic of the Anthropocene, the answer to the problem of control is more control. These new efforts, you add, begin with a planet remade and spirals back on itself. Not so much the control of nature as a control of the control of nature. Later in the book, you say to the same effect, the issue at this point is not whether we're going to alter nature, but to what end. And you outline, as I kind of alluded to, many different examples of the control of nature. You talk about managing various fish populations, how to deal with the drowning of Louisiana's Mississippi River, efforts to assist the evolution of corals, efforts to save species from going to extinct. I wonder which of, and I know you've talked about all of these examples many times in various interviews. Have there been any kind of recent examples that didn't make their way into the book? Or is, in some ways, I was thinking, Betsy, is COVID an example of this? We're trying to tame and stamp out COVID, which is an example of the control of nature.
Well, it's interesting that you asked that, because I just actually wrote a new afterword for the book.
Oh, really?
Yeah, for the paperback, which is coming out in the States in a couple months, and it took on COVID, which is very much, I think, part of this pattern where we, so COVID is very much example. I talk in the book. This is not my term. I did not make up this term. This idea of a coupled human and natural system, which is often used to describe the Mississippi Delta, which is now this very highly engineered landscape where the river is basically being locked in place by a series of pharaonic engineering projects, and that's causing all sorts of problems, which we can talk about. But anyway, it's referred to as a coupled human and natural system because obviously the Mississippi still has a tremendous amount of power, even if it's being channeled, by humanity. So both forces are pushing up against each other. And in the case of COVID, we have, I think, a similar dynamic. I mean, humans, I'm going to lay aside for a moment the idea that, that we created this virus. I don't think that's very likely. It jumped, let's say it's a pretty ordinary what's called a spillover event. It jumped species either directly from bats to humans, or more likely from bats to intermediary species, and then to humans. And then it got into the human population. And because of the way we live, because of the way we are such a globalized society, it was almost instantaneously, it was very difficult to contain. It could have been potentially contained had the Chinese immediately jumped on it and tried to control it in Wuhan, in November, December of 2019. But that opportunity was missed, and then it was everywhere. And social control measures did clearly, were no longer going to work to get rid of it. So we all sat around at home, many of us for many months, waiting for the great technofix that was going to save us, that was going to be a vaccine. And those vaccines are cutting edge vaccines. They use a very sophisticated, brand new vaccine technology, mRNA vaccines. But now we are realizing that technofix is also not exactly a fix, and that this virus has, still does have an independent existence. So these systems are deeply intertwined, and we're not very good at the social control measures that we might have deployed to minimize the damage. But we're very good at the technological, and that's I think why we keep seeing this pattern. We're much better at that.
Yeah, I wanted to quote you. This is kind of late in the book when you're talking about geoengineering, which is another kind of huge techno fix that we'll talk about. But you say what the technology addresses are warning symptoms. So in the case also of the pandemic, we're treating the symptoms, not its cause. For this reason, geoengineering, or you could argue the vaccine, you write, has been compared to treating a heroin habit with methadone, though perhaps a more apt comparison would be to be treating a heroin habit with amphetamines. The end result is two addictions in the place of one. My question is, if the control of nature in the first order, because we're talking now about the control of the control, in the first order has mostly created havoc, whether it's a pandemic or global warming or climate change, why do we think that more control is the answer? And you use this phrase that you've used elsewhere, we're jammed up. I guess to what extent are we locked into the cycle of the Anthropocene, and we're locked into the idea of more control as the only option?
Well, I think that, just to step back a minute, one of the scientists that I speak to in the book, he raises this question, I'm sort of needling him, and we're talking about geoengineering, which I should just explain for perhaps as not deep into it, is this idea that we will counteract, climate change will counteract all of this CO2 we put up into the air that's warming the earth by spraying reflective particles in the stratosphere. And that will have a cooling effect because it will actually reflect sunlight, balance sunlight back to earth. And he and I were talking about this, and I was, saying, wow, we don't have a great, great record here in this kind of intervention. And he pushed back and said, well, do you consider agriculture, a mistake? Agriculture, you could argue, is, the seminal intervention is when people stopped. I suppose you could argue that tools were already a pretty big innovation, but some animals, I guess, have tools, not really human level tools, but okay. But once we invent agriculture and we become sedentary creatures and we domesticate plants and animals, we really have taken a major step to try to buffer ourselves from, nature and create this man-made or human-controlled landscape. And some people, Jared Diamond, has called out, agriculture the greatest mistake in human history. It led down this path to where we are today, and one technological innovation on top of another, and a really big one was the invention about a century ago of synthetic fertilizers, which enabled us to really radically increase our population. It's estimated that something like 3 billion people are alive today because of synthetic fertilizers. So once you have put in place all of these systems of, we'll call them control for lack of a better word, though maybe there is a better word, and you have expanded, your population and your needs to fit that that landscape, it's not like you can suddenly go back and say, I think that synthetic fertilizers are a very simple and clear example. You could say, well, let's go back. They cause all sorts of problems. We're creating aquatic dead zones because we flush a lot of fertilizer into the Gulf of Mexico, into all sorts of waterways. We won't need to go there right now, but anyway, let's just stipulate that there are a lot of downsides to dumping a lot of fertilizer on the landscape and changing the whole nitrogen cycle. But we're committed to that. We're not going back to, agriculture that does not depend on synthetic fertilizers, because we would have to basically give up on 3 billion people, many of whom are ourselves. So that's just not a viable solution. So we have this sort of, Rube Goldberg-esque machinery that we've built up. And I think we are, to use the word jammed up again, we're in a jam. That's really the thematic of the book, I guess. It's not, one could somewhat romantically say, well, why don't we just go back? But going back is not, in a lot of these instances, is just not really a viable alternative at this point.
Yeah, you write this kind of the strongest, this is not in the context of geoengineering, this is in the context of CRISPR and gene editing. you write the strongest case is for what's the alternative. Rejecting such technologies unnatural isn't going to bring nature back, as we've kind of established now 3 times or 4 times. The choice is not between what was and what is, but between what is and what will be, which often enough is nothing. Very bleak.
Yeah. Well, that, I think, as I recall, that comes in the context of, sort of a discussion of invasive species, which is another genie, as it were, that's pretty much impossible to put back in the bottle. And, one of the species, or really, I guess it's more than one species that I talk about are rats, which humans have released, taken all around the world. There are rats now on islands that are uninhabited by people, but some ship landed there at some point and released rats, and they do very well. Rats do extremely well, usually where they've been transplanted, and they're just absolutely devastating, as you can imagine, for some of these island ecosystems which evolved totally in the absence of rodents. They eat the ground nesting bird eggs. We can go on the damage that they do. People have actually gotten quite good at de-ratting islands of a certain size, but they have to be pretty contained, because you have to sort of do it all at once. Otherwise, your rats come in from different parts of the island. But that usually involves doing things like dropping anticoagulants from the air, and the rats eat this bait and they bleed to death internally. And that has obvious problems. So in that chapter, I'm talking about, these efforts to, could you use gene editing to get rid of some of these invasive species? And that raises, a whole other set of really, you could call them interesting, you can call them horrifying possibilities.
Okay, this kind of gets to a question that I had a little bit later, but this idea of interesting or horrifying, the kind of like constant tension of, I guess, various binaries that you lay out in the book. So your things are either horrifying or wonderful, I'm citing you here, dazzling or unnerving, visionary or wacky, sublime or bleak, totally cool or totally crazy. How did you manage to kind of equivocate again and again in your writing? Yeah.
Well, that's another really good question. The book is sort of attempting, and I can't attest to how successfully, to enter this argument, I guess, about, between those who would sort of espouse, although it's a little bit fuzzy, I have to say, some kind of return, like, let's use, nature will heal itself. And those who are enthralled with technology and want to embrace these technologies and say, this is great. I mean, someone wrote a review of the book who was like, well, we should just use geoengineering, not out of desperation, but just because we could. It would be cool, let's just do it, which is a pretty interesting position to take when you're talking about, re-engineering the stratosphere with pretty unknown, a lot of potential unknown consequences. But there's one part of the world today that's just in love with technology, and there is another group that's just, very anti-GMOs, very anti using technology to alter the world. How's that? And I guess was trying to walk that very fine line, what I see as a fine line, between saying, both of these positions are really not, when you think about them, they're not, neither of them is really entirely, and they're viable, obviously, but I don't really subscribe to either of them. And I think that we are in a position where, as you and I have just discussed, we've already radically altered the world. We're not in a position to just let it, go back. There is no going back, as one of the characters in the book points out, one of the scientists, and we're also not really in a position to embrace all these technologies and just say everything's going to turn out fine. We're in this moment of kind of radical uncertainty, which people despise, but that is where we are. And I guess I was trying to get at that, and I was trying to get at it with enough humor, honestly, so that people read it, even though it should leave you pretty uncomfortable. It shouldn't leave you feeling that there is a clear way out of any of these problems.
I'm so glad you brought up the humor, because that's what I really enjoyed so much about the book, Betsy, is that despite kind of the doom and gloom, and there is so much, whether you read your book or whether you just read any newspaper on any given day, your tone is kind of composed and reserved, but then also at times very wry and funny. And I just wanted to kind of read 3 of my favorite funny moments. The first is when you're waiting or describing coral having sex, and you say that you were kind of standing around the coral and waiting for them to get in the mood. Then you described I guess this person kind of falls into more of the somebody who's really embracing technology, somebody called Josiah Zania, who calls himself a genetic designer, and who attempted to deactivate one of his genes so he could grow bigger biceps. And then this is one of my particularly favorite moments that I think really captures our very strange relationship to nature as it stands now. So this is an interaction between a scientist and a toad whose genes had been edited by CRISPR, and you write of the scientist, Cooper reached a glove hand into the tank and pulled out Blondie, who's this gene-edited toad, whom she described to me as beautiful, and he immediately peed on her.
That was a lucky break, yeah.
Did you find yourself maybe out of discomfort, maybe out of horror, maybe because some things are just so kind of mad in this world, laughing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even a lot of the scientists, I think, are sort of stuck in this kind of, is this completely cool or completely kooky mode? I mean, it's pretty, once again, because our sort of technological abilities so outpace our ability to figure out, whether we should be doing these things, or we're faced with this, kind of constant, sort of black humor. I mean, I really think that is all around us, and I'm sure many of the people here today watched Don't Look Up, and that was the same, I think, sort of impulse. How do you deal with a problem like this? Well, you can try to take on its full horror, but people do tend to turn away, and that movie was trying to reach a very broad audience and succeeded in reaching a very broad audience, which I don't think any, straight up, global warming is, gonna get us all movie would have. So I think that the impulse, I certainly didn't reach as 1/1,000,000th of the audience that did, but I think that impulse that, let's try to turn this around and look at it in a darkly comic way has, sort of that movie was very, very, I would, derivative of Dr. Strangelove, I guess you would say. But the original Dr. Strangelove obviously is the model for all of us. I mean, completely the bleakest, most brilliant, most darkly funny work of art out there. I think my absolute favorite movie.
I'm so glad you brought this up, because I watched it last night to prepare to think about this, and I think you do such a fantastic job in your book of reporting. So there's the kind of humorous side, and there's also you're essentially grounding these huge scientific transformations, in kind of like local, tangible examples. And yet so much of this crisis is the vast scientific, mathematical parts of it. And you do, I think, also a really great job of explaining for those of us who are kind of like lay scientists who took science in high school, but not really beyond, or maybe were forced to take it in college. And I think both parts are equally important, and yet, as you kind of pointed out, Don't Look Up had such a kind of vast audience precisely because it didn't kind of dwell on the science so much and the numbers. And this, there's a quote, so for anyone who hasn't seen it, basically Leonardo DiCaprio plays this kind of very charming scientist, and he, along with his colleague, PhD student Jennifer Lawrence, discover that a comet is set to destroy the Earth in T minus 7 months, 8 months. The idea is supposed to kind of stand in for climate change, and they are about to go on air on a talk show, and I think one of the showrunners says something like to Leonardo DiCaprio, it's his first time on television, he's incredibly nervous, he's taken about 3 Xanaxes, and the showrunner says to him, keep it simple, no maths. And then Leonardo DiCaprio says, kind of right before they go on air, but it's all math, I don't understand. And so I guess my question to you is how do you include both? How are you kind of scientifically and mathematically responsible to these scientists and professors that you're talking to, while also trying to explain it and explain it in a way that actually is moving and urgent?
Well,
I'm sure this is something you've grappled with through your whole career.
That's a tough one. I mean, I am one of those people who really hasn't studied science since high school, so I definitely consider myself to be my target audience, and if I don't understand it, I figure, I'm going to get someone to explain it until I do. But it is quite difficult. I think that one of the reasons why climate change has, one of the many reasons why it has evoked such an inadequate response, is that the science, while not terribly complicated, is somewhat complicated, and it involves understanding that once you build certain things into this system, you're not getting them back. It's not like a lot of ordinary problems, including even fairly ordinary environmental problems, where when we decided, that smog was a big problem in the 60s, we passed the Clean Air Act, we, installed catalytic converters in cars and really reduced the output of smog causing chemicals. And now you go to LA or someplace like that, and where you used to see this terrible pall of smog hanging over, and the air is a lot cleaner. And that didn't take that much time to sort of rectify that situation. With climate change, the problem and the reason that we are doing things like talking about geoengineering is because once you've put this stuff up there, it's very, very difficult to get it down, and you're not solving the problem in any human time frame. So this idea, I think people still do have the idea, once we get serious about climate change, once we start bringing down our emissions, we will, solve this problem. You still have people talking about solving climate change. Climate change will never be solved. It will always be with us. And that is because of the long, long tail of this problem. And so even here, I've done an inadequate job of explaining it, but that element of the problem is slightly complicated. And I think, I don't know even if in the book I managed to convey that. So I think that we are in a position where there's sort of like a valley here of people's understanding that's very hard to get through. And I struggle with that as a journalist, all the time, every day.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think you do a fantastic job. And
Thank you.
And you also cite people, so writers, poets, kind of essayists, artists in the book who I think are also doing in their own way wonderful kind of job at putting words or kind of emotions to feelings that we have about nature. But it struck me, Betsy, that a lot of these people are from the kind of 19th and 20th centuries. So talking about Byron, Lord Byron, E.O. Wilson, who of course died last year, Aldo Leopold, Thoreau, Kurt Vonnegut, T.S. Eliot. And I was just wondering if you feel like this is a kind of former generation of artists who were responding to the crisis, and who are the kind of contemporary artists who you feel are rising to the challenge. And actually more broadly, and this is a really big question, but what is the role of art and kind of culture in this fight, let's say, ongoing and forever fight?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a really important and interesting question, and there are a lot of increasing people in this space doing all sorts of interesting things. I was interviewing Maya Lin recently, who had a really interesting installation up at Madison Square Park in Manhattan, which is very much was her, it was an attempt by her. She has a bunch of projects, and I think it was a very striking project. In terms of the visual arts, I absolutely want to, say that I'm not qualified to say who's doing good work, but the question of, what's the role of art, and I do, and I think Don't Look Up, which some people consider art and some people consider, not art, but just a goofy movie or whatever, that I also don't feel qualified to really say, but it clearly reached a big audience. Okay, did it have a big impact? Now these are things that are really hard to tease out, and I do think that because climate change requires such a massive change from the ground up, in the way that we do business, and I would also argue, I suppose, in the way that we live, is any artwork going to accomplish that? It would be ridiculous to ask that of a piece of art. But is there a role in changing the way people look at the world? One of the things that Maya Lin said to me that really struck me, which I think was useful and true, was artists' role is to imagine different worlds. That's sort of what they do, right? I mean, nonfiction writers write about the world as it is, and artists write about different worlds. And I think there is a huge role to imagine different worlds and perhaps imagine different futures. And has anyone hit on that formula yet? I'm not exactly aware of it, but that I think a lot of people are contributing and making big contributions. How's that?
No, I think it's true, and even kind of not thinking about the people who are creating it, but just the idea of the imagination, and even the power of a metaphor itself. So you open your book with a metaphor. You say that you're describing the Mississippi River, and you say, rivers make good metaphors, too good perhaps, and then you go on to kind of talk about our control of various rivers and the fish that we find there. I suppose, is it also, do you think, kind of like formally speaking, do we need more new metaphors? Do we need new ways of telling stories? I mean, not just only kind of like who is creating, but the kind of form, the kind of communication of this.
I struggle with that a lot. And I also struggle with the relationship, to somewhat contradict what I just said 2 minutes ago, with the relationship between, what we write and what we paint and what we, imagine and what we do. I mean, a lot of the work that needs to be done is, it's the opposite of metaphor. It's really concrete. It's very, redoing our electrical grid. If someone can come up with a good, metaphor for that, I'd be really super, super impressed, or a metaphor that really grabs, people's imagination and really stirs them in some way. It's really nitty gritty engineering work, a lot of it, and that is very hard to make exciting or interesting. And, as I say, to contradict myself, which I'm probably pretty good at, the real work to be done. I do sometimes worry when I go to art exhibits or read about someone, who's doing the latest installation or whatever, and that is very self-reflexive. It doesn't really have any bearing on, we're doing it for ourselves. And I worry about that in my own writing too. And, sometimes I think, I should be out there installing solar panels. Maybe that would be more useful, because the real work to be done is not necessarily terribly imaginative, but much more nitty gritty.
This is a kind of another unanswerable piece of this, but we haven't talked at all. You mentioned broadly kind of systems and the status quo, and of course there's the economic system, and then there's the political system as we have it. They're inextricably linked. Do you feel that as it stands, solutions will come through these more traditional channels?
Well, that's a huge debate. And there are those people who say there's no way we can, solve these problems. And once again, I use the word, I never use the word solve, really, because we're not solving this, we're making it more manageable or less manageable. How's that? But there are some people who say, well, capitalism is the most efficient way to do this, where, we should put a price on carbon, and then we will let the marketplace, solve this problem, solve in quotes. And there's some people who say the marketplace has, capitalism has proved itself utterly incapable. It's the source of all these problems. And then there's the question of, well, if that's true, if the capitalist system is incapable of solving these problems, which is more frightening, which is going to, which is harder to change, really, the electrical grid or the whole economic system. Unfortunately, I don't see any signs of capitalism's, collapse. Maybe, let's talk in a few months, you never know. But so I think, my general answer is we have to hope that capitalism can deal with these problems, because I don't see on the horizon the political support for radical alternatives at this point. In fact, we're in the US, we seem to be, in a pretty, well, our politics seem to be totally dysfunctional, but they don't seem to be heading towards a new economic system.
And of course, in Don't Look Up, the real, for anyone who's seen it, this isn't kind of giving anything away, because you would imagine this in real life too. The moment that the politician, the president, played by Meryl Streep, starts acting is when it's in her political interest to do so. So imagine similar things might happen. I'm just wondering, as you look to the future, and also I'd like to encourage anyone to post a question or a comment in the chat. We'll turn to questions now. But before we do that, I think one could draw, or you, I think, have drawn a line between your book, The Sixth Extinction, about the sixth mass extinction, which you argued and it's true, is caused by human beings. You kind of went looking for the next step and wondering what humans were going to do about this havoc that they've created. And it was kind of out of that inquiry that Under a White Sky was born. What is the next step after Under a White Sky, and is the next step even possible?
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer to that. I really am struggling with it. I mean, after the Sixth Extinction, I sort of felt like I had, written myself into a corner, and now now I really feel a bit like I've written myself into a corner. So I'm really not sure. Maybe, yeah, something totally different, or learning how to install solar panels. I'm not sure.
Okay, a final question before we turn to the chat, but I read in an interview that you gave and you described yourself as an old-fashioned environmentalist. Do you feel that, having written Under a White Sky, that your sense of being an old-fashioned environmentalist has changed?
Not radically. I do think that I suppose I have parted ways with the old-fashioned environmentalism in that I see the fight against genetically modified organisms as hopeless. That one's sort of over. That cow has left the barn, I guess. But I am skeptical of a lot of the interventions that we're contemplating. How's that? I think that there's a lot of hubris involved in all of these, and so I guess I'm an old-fashioned environmentalist in that I think that humans should, in the face of all of this, particularly have a lot of humility about their impact on the planet. But that doesn't solve the problem of what do we do, as I say. Mm-hmm. So I guess I have had to question some of my own convictions. And I also, another thing that I think, I guess I would say, where I guess I sort of part ways with old-fashioned environmentalists, is I think there's a lot of sort of fuzzy math in a lot of these a lot of solutions. You're going to hear a lot. You're just going to keep hearing this about, sort of nature-based solutions, that there's all sorts of ways we could soak up carbon by, planting trees and things like that. And when you really do the math, planting trees is a great idea. And in some places it's not a great idea in other places. But, the math is pretty, it's very, very difficult, and it's impossible to get the math to work out, so I think I am in favor, though not being a terribly great mathematician myself, of being pretty hard-headed about what we're talking about. And I sometimes do think, unfortunately, that the environmental movement isn't willing to do that. But I am still attached to the idea that I know to be romantic, of wild places.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Betsy. We have some great questions in the chat. So we have a question from Daniel Salinas, who asks, are young people today ready for environmental action? What or how should science education teach students about the environmental crisis? So essentially, what is the role of the educational system in all of this? It's a great point.
Well, I mean, I think that's another really good question. I mean, I think that educators really struggle, and I often speak at colleges, and I sometimes even speak at high schools, although I try to avoid doing that.
Why?
Well, because the news is pretty dark, and I think that there's I think when you're dealing with little kids, you do want to inspire a sort of a love of the natural world and a sense of wonder, and it's kind of cliched, but I do agree with it. But then when I think there's a lot of ways in which educators feel, well, it's simply too heavy for me to really lay this number on 10-year-olds that that they're facing this inevitably warmer and bleaker future. So we're going to say, well, okay, things are messed up, but there's all these things you can do, like make sure to put your aluminum can in the recycling. Well, that's just not going to cut it. That's just not sufficient. And I think you can sort of start to say that to college students, that water bottle that you're carrying, that's great, don't use plastic water bottles, but that's not going to solve this problem, but it's hard to say that to little kids. So I think that these are sort of empirical questions, and I hope people are doing a lot of work. What are the best ways to sort of communicate a planetary emergency to little kids? I don't know what they are. So as I say, because I don't want to, send little kids into, having nightmares or whatever. I honestly try not to be one of those people.
Thank you.
I guess I gave my own children nightmares though, because one of my kids actually went into climate science. So
it's probably inspired by your example, not terrified.
one or the other.
Or maybe both in the spirit of the binary. Betsy Ann Carl wants to know, what role do you think women specifically play in finding a resolution for environmental issues? Is it gender?
Well, that's another really good question. Yeah. I mean, I think that there, once again, is this just a cliche? I mean, I think that women have played very important roles, just from a sort of political / diplomatic perspective. The head of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for a long time was a woman named Christiana Figueres, whom I really like a lot. She's a wonderful person. And there were a lot of women who played key roles, including, a lot of French women in putting together the Paris Climate Agreement, where whatever you sort of, wherever that stands right now. So I think in general, women politicians have played a key role, and women scientists have also played a key role, female scientists. But do I want to say that women have a different role to play from men in this? I'm not sure I do want to say that, I mean, that I suppose there's a sense in which, women as mothers and, maybe are we more concerned about our kids than men? Maybe. There's definitely a lot of moms groups out there working on clean air and working on climate change. And I, applaud that. I'm just not 100% sure I want to say that there should be a difference. How's that?
What about the traditional idea that that the earth is female?
Yeah, I think there is something very powerful about that, I suppose. Mother Nature, absolutely. The giver of life. I think that there is something powerful about that. So perhaps women, out of sheer solidarity with the earth, do have a certain role to play.
Here's a question that I wonder if not only this person has wondered, but they ask, what helps you get up every morning?
Not very good at getting up.
Coffee.
In the morning. You only get one shot at this life. How's that? And you better make them, you better get out of bed in the morning and make the best of it, I think. But, if the underlying question is, are you, dismayed or despondent over what's going on? Yeah, the answer is yeah. I see very, very few, really, really hopeful signs out there. And, especially here in the US, where things are just, the political system seems so broken. It's really hard to even see how we can do the very simplest things, much less the really, really tough ones. So I think it's a pretty, if you're, not pessimistic, you're kind of not paying attention. But, we all live with all of these terrible contradictions in our lives. And I guess I do too.
Let's end on a fairly positive note. Where is the hope? I mean, if you could say that, if you could point the audience to a hopeful direction as a kind of final thought, what would you say?
Well, I would say that, human beings have been in some pretty bad jams before, and, terrible things have happened in history. But we have, I don't even want to say found a way out, but life has gone on. And I do think life will continue to go on. I hope it will not. I hope that we will come up with, either technologically or socially, ways of living and doing things that will allow us to to continue to, you know, be the best of humanity and leave the worst of humanity behind. And I guess that's the most hopeful thing I can say. And the least hopeful thing I can say is, you know, that there are dark forces at work already, and we haven't even, this shit has not hit the fan yet. So, you know, that's scary.
Betsy, thank you so much for joining us virtually this afternoon, your Sunday afternoon, our evening in Paris. So on the American Library in Paris, Columbia Global Centers Paris, and the Institute for Ideas and Imagination, thank you